Hi, welcome to Soul Mechanics. My name is Ron Carswell. Jim Hecker is on assignment today, and today we'll be discussing law enforcement schizophrenia in America. It's caused by the war on drugs, a failed policy begun a long time ago, started in 1937 with hearings before the Congress of the United States of America called the Marijuana Tax Act, which misclassified cannabis a Class 1 narcotic. All forms of scientific evidence have proven over and over again that cannabis in no form is addictive and is therefore misclassified. However, the federal government, in its wisdom and also the way of doing business, continues to treat cannabis as a Class 1 narcotic, arresting over 1.5 million people. In the latest year, statistics were accurately accounted for, which was 2011. 70,000 people in Mexico have died in the drug wars, and simply trying to supply the need in America that's created for both recreational and medical uses. Now, it's interesting because there are two states where it's completely legal, including recreational use, and both of those states, since the legalization process took place, have seen enormous caseloads taken away from their courts, allowing the courts to actually focus on real crimes and giving the judges the ability to do law enforcement the way that it was intended in the states. And the other 48 states where it's not legal for recreational are certainly studying the statistics, the economics, and the law enforcement and the policies that both Washington State and Colorado have enjoyed since legalization. The war on drugs, its largest failure, of course, is its incarceration rate. In the United States, the population represents 5% of the world's population, and yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. So there is clearly an indication that the law enforcement systems, including the war on drugs, have done nothing to rehabilitate these people who are arrested for cannabis. It merely incarcerates them, mostly these days in for-profit prisons, where you're required to work during your time served, and you're paid 20 cents an hour to do tasks ranging anything from manufacturing products for the Koch brothers, who are major supporters of for-profit prison systems in many of the states, and quite literally responsible through the organization ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, for the creation of the current mandatory sentencing and first-time nonviolent offender incarceration rates, because they profit from that. And the Department of Justice clearly indicating that the majority of people in prison are persons of color. In fact, 4 out of 5 incarcerated Americans are persons of color, which shows you how the justice system has used a very, very insipid law, which some people stand behind on high moral grounds, to actually incarcerate the people that they least want to succeed and have an equal opportunity in their society. It's clear by the spending of the Koch brothers, $400 million of their own pocket change on the last election cycle, that they would like to see the conservative issues that they push through ALEC on lazy legislators state by state slowly through the process of starting with school boards, moving to county supervisor positions and city aldermen, city councilmen, and moving into the governor's offices in states clear across America, insidiously spending millions and millions of dollars lobbying for positions that benefit them and the coke industries, but do not benefit the society, nor the law enforcement, nor the courts who are mandated to uphold these laws, including mandatory minimum sentences for first-time nonviolent drug offenses. So it's about time for the federal government of the United States to take a serious look at the legislation that created cannabis as a Class 1 narcotic and do a reclassification, if not a total legalization, so that law enforcement can actually get back to work on real crime. They could spend more time working on cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine instead of chasing cannabis. Secondarily, you would see the court system begin to reflect more the demographics of the United States and its diverse populations, and you would see a significant reduction in the black and Chicano prisoner population in the United States if these laws were actually brought in conformance with current scientific evidence that it is not a narcotic and should never have been classified as a Class 1 and treated so. The U.S. government, war on drugs, spent approximately $51 billion last year fighting the war on drugs. 1.53 million arrests were prosecuted as a result of that. And in 2011, it's estimated that nonviolent drug charges were leveled against 1.5 million people. If you take all the people who have been prosecuted under cannabis law in the United States who have lost their civil rights and cannot vote in the next presidential election cycle, it constitutes a group of 5.5 million people, of which I happen to be one. As a cannabis criminal, I haven't had the right to vote since I was charged and prosecuted for possession in 1972. And that means I've had no voice in the American democracy, nor in the choosing of our presidents, nor have I been allowed to participate in politics at the local level because I'm not a registered voter. I can't even sign a petition in the state of Arizona that would go to the legislature, creating the kinds of medical marijuana legal issues that we have in Arizona, where the head of that policy setting organization, Mr. Will Humble, has finally agreed that cannabis should be studied for its usefulness with post-traumatic stress disorder. 22 veterans in America commit suicide on a daily basis, and almost every one of them has been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And it took this long in the state of Arizona for the director of the Public Health Policy Institute that administers the law that the Arizona citizens wrote and passed themselves 3 different times before it was finally implemented. Mr. Will is finally going to allow veterans to be tested with cannabis for the use of post-traumatic stress disorder treatment. There was a psychiatrist who was working on creating a grant for the University of Arizona to study post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans using cannabis. And she was recently fired summarily without any reason and without any due process. I do hope that Northern Arizona University would be smart enough to immediately hire her to run her research program, which will be funded completely, not with state funds, not with federal funds, but through a grant, through the National Institute of Mental Health. And if they're intelligent enough to hire her, then those studies can take place at all 10 Northern Arizona University campuses instead of the one campus of the University of Arizona where Dr. Sisley was summarily fired without cause and without reason. It's clear that Mr. Andy Biggs in the Arizona Senate is responsible for the political firing that took place. And I do wish that Mr. Biggs would inform himself of the facts on cannabis, inform himself on the facts of the use of medical marijuana, and inform himself in a non-biased, factual, scientific, evidential way, begin to run the Senate of the state of Arizona and the legislature as though it were a science-based community, and stop basing the war on drugs and the policy, the way that it's carried out here in the state of Arizona, on non-factual information. Governor Christie from New Jersey said that the war on drugs, while well-intentioned, has been a total failure. In the state of New Jersey, we're warehousing drug prisoners at a cost of $49,000 a year in state prison, when a full year of inpatient drug treatment only costs $24,000. And so you can see where the policies established in the legislatures, pushed by ALEC through the Koch brothers and their funding of lazy legislation, has deepened the mandatory sentencing laws and created criminals out of people who did nothing more criminal than smoke cannabis. It's been proven time and time again in studies overseas that concentrated cannabinoid oils will actually stop the seizures in certain kinds of children who have disorders of the spine and the spinal column. It's been proven that cannabinoid oils in concentration actually kill all 3 forms of breast cancer without any collateral damage and without the indignities suffered by modern cancer survivors who made it through the treatment that we call cobalt radiation bombardment, or what's the other killer that they do? Chemotherapy. If your body manages to live through those 2 forms of treatment, then apparently you're cured. The studies that proved that you could simply ingest concentrated THC oils, cannabinoid oils, into the bloodstream and kill all 3 known forms of breast cancer, those studies overseas have never been allowed to be shared with American medical colleges. The studies that were done in the United States on breast cancer using cannabis hashish oil in the 80s were quashed by the DEA, and a gag order was placed on the scientists responsible for the studies, never to speak about them again under threat of incarceration or suits. So it seems like the Drug Enforcement Agency doesn't want you to know the truth about this evil weed, cannabis, that they're fighting on so many fronts and publishing statistics about how successful they are in interdicting it, stopping the supply, reducing the use, none of which is based on fact. In fact, available supplies indicated by the street prices and the availability in most American cities has never been higher than it currently is, which indicates that the federal government is willing to spend $51 billion last year on the war on drugs, not accomplishing their mission and not rehabilitating anyone in the process, not doing justice to the American Constitution and the policies of the federal government of the United States. Now, it's true that this month, Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States, has said that it's time for a reconsideration on mandatory sentencing and sentencing lengths, because the American prison system is literally awash in prisoners. There are more prisoners in America per capita than any other nation on earth at any other time in history. And the policies that are placing Americans there include 87% of the arrests are for simple possession or use of cannabis and or possession of contraband paraphernalia for the use of cannabis. There are 21 states where medical marijuana is legal, and the District of Columbia is also true. The tax revenues, if cannabis were legalized, are estimated to be somewhere around $46 to $47 billion on an annual basis. And since the federal government is only spending $51 billion on the entire war on drugs, on all different substances, then the lifting the restrictions on the use of cannabis, taxing it under the Department of Agriculture, which would make sense, would actually begin to offset the deficit that the federal government has created by spending $1 trillion on the war on drug since I was arrested in the 70s. And that's probably closer to $2 trillion when you think of all the covert operations and the black budget off-balance sheet things that are done by very fancy legislators who've been trained and schooled by the Koch brothers and their organization ALEC on how to get away with anything. And then you insist that it's the states' rights, which takes precedent over federal law, except when it benefits you to say, oh, we can't do that because it's against federal law. Like the distribution of cannabis to clinics for trials in Arizona, all of the cannabis has to be purchased from the National Institute of Mental Health. And the supply availability at the National Institute of Mental Health is currently running 18 months. You heard that, folks. That's 1.5 years behind current demand. So, new studies are not allowed to use the cannabis that is taken from growers or importers or people who smuggle it. That has to be burned in a facility instead of being put to use to offset the cost of the war on drugs. And it occurs to me that Dr. Sisley was summarily fired from the University of Arizona for suggesting that the funds from the legal medical marijuana card process in the state of Arizona, that those funds be allowed to be used to purchase the cannabis used in studies in the state of Arizona to determine further medical benefits from the use of cannabis, including post-traumatic stress disorder, which kills 22 veterans every day in the United States by suicide. So you can see where law enforcement cannot defend itself in the charge that they are currently operating in a schizophrenic methodology of enforcement, that they will allow medical marijuana in 21 states and the District of Columbia, that they will allow legal recreational use of cannabis in 2 states, Colorado and Washington, and yet in the other states, they're spending $51 billion of your tax money fighting the war on drugs. So, it appears to me that there are some intelligent Americans advocating a change in the policy of the United States in the war on drugs. I'd like to read what Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, had to say about it. Can any policy, however high-minded, be moral if it leads to the widespread corruption, imprisons so many, has so racist an effect, destroys our inner cities, wreaks havoc on misguided and vulnerable individuals, and brings death and destruction in foreign countries? Now there's a gentleman with a Nobel Prize in economics looking at the failed policy of the war on drugs. Pat Robertson, the founder of the Christian Broadcasting Network and a well-known evangelist, has this to say: we've got to take a look at what we're considering crimes. I'm not exactly for the use of drugs, don't get me wrong, but I just think criminalizing marijuana, criminalizing the possession of a few ounces of pot, is costing us a fortune and ruining young people who go into prison as youths and come out hardened gang member criminals. Thank you, Pat Robertson, for your insights. I can remember when I was arrested in the 70s, you were still referring to it as the devil's weed, an instrument of destruction in the society of America. Seems to me the war on drugs got a really big push during the Nixon administration. Seems like the Nixons had a policy where you could divert the attention of the American public from true crimes like the Iran-Contra scandal and like the shipping of arms overseas, etc., because you could make law enforcement do high-profile criminal cases against people for nothing more destructive than their personal choice of freedom to use an herb. Since that time, that herb has been discovered to have many medicinal qualities that other countries have enjoyed the use of in their medical professions for quite some time. And you've seen them do that without any high social costs and without ruining their moral stance in the world. The ex-president Jimmy Carter said penalties for the possession of a drug should not be more damaging to an individual than the use of the drug itself. And along those lines, I certainly hope that the federal government of the United States is prepared to end the war on drugs and to begin a focused war on cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines. If legalization of cannabis and hemp in the United States were done on a national basis, we probably could alter the economy of the United States to become a self-sustaining, independent nation where the Constitution matters. Thank you and have a nice day.